Most people were never taught how the Bible actually works. We were taught what to believe from it, but not how it was designed to communicate meaning. And when you read it the wrong way, confusion and frustration are almost inevitable. This is a two-part conversation with biblical scholar Tim Mackie, and it's foundational for everything we do at Faith Lab. In part one, Tim helps retrain how you read the Bible. What kind of book is this? Why repetition and patterns matter? And why treating it like a rule book or a textbook misses the point entirely. In part two, we'll take that same framework and explore how it reshapes the way Christians think about Jesus, ethics, and what it actually means to call Scripture the Word of God. Tim Mackie is a biblical scholar and co-founder of the Bible Project, known for helping millions of people understand the Bible as a unified literary story. This conversation originally took place a few years ago on a previous podcast I hosted, but it's so central to the vision of Faith Lab that I wanted to bring it forward here, lightly reframed and with some added commentary, so new listeners can encounter it fresh. Here's part one of our conversation with Tim Mackie.
My interest in more academic biblical studies came after a couple years where I'd been taking classes on the Bible as literature in college. But once I got exposed to the Dead Sea Scrolls and began to read around, the floodlights that those texts shed on the scribal origins and the processes by which the biblical text came into existence, that launched me into a whole next level of just how these texts came into existence, period. And so I got really interested in manuscript histories and the early translations of the Bible and the formation of the canon, these collections of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And then I really nerded out on that for a lot of years. And then I kind of came back around to my early interests in the literary poetics and the communication strategies that these Hebrew authors employed, and how their mindset for thinking and reading and communicating is totally different than how we as moderns read and think. Let me just start with a concrete example. I think we often in religious communities that grow up around the Bible, there are unspoken storylines about how these texts came into existence that tend to not ever get talked about very explicitly, but they really inform what you're looking for when you pick up the Bible and try and read it. Whether it's their golden tablets fallen from heaven and humans had little or no agency involved, that's a common view for some. For others, it would be the opposite, that it's merely, well, this would be more on the skeptic's end, that it's just like primitive Israelite shepherd literature, or oral folk tales or that kind of thing. And so in the middle, however, is what I mean, and this is in the last 100 years, we just have so much great uh, information and comparative and even Israelite data from archaeology about how texts were produced in the ancient world, how oral histories would have been passed on, and the processes by which the biblical texts were formed. We just have so much to work with now that even scholars didn't have 150 years ago to inform. And it's very different. It's not golden tablets from heaven, but it's also not primitive shepherd literature either. We're dealing with highly intelligent, educated, brilliant, ancient literary artists and biblical and theologians who want to communicate the most profound truths about the kind of world that we're living in and human nature and the mystery of who God is and his purposes in the world. So maybe a couple metaphors might help. So the biblical authors didn't sit down and write from scratch most of this literature. So let's just talk about Hebrew Bible for a while. So just the what Christians call the Old Testament. The way texts were produced in the ancient world, this is tradition literature. This is a people's spiritual heritage, but also their cultural heritage. And so tradition literature is literature that comes into existence through many generations. Each generation inherits and also adapts and shapes and honors and studies what came before it and also passes it on. So what the biblical authors are doing most of the time is arranging and adapting pre-existing stories and poems that have come down to them from previous generations. And so one metaphor that I've come to use is the the Old Testament isn't like, you go into like a nursery, like an urban plant nursery in the city, and it'll be like a parking lot that they've converted into a nursery or something like that, and it's a bunch of potted plants, and they're all like scooted in together, and so like the small trees are over here, and the rhododendrons are here and over there, and that kind of thing. They're all like discrete objects, in the nursery. And that's sometimes how we think about the books of the Bible, that they're these independent entities. The reality is that the Hebrew Bible, especially, is much more like going out to Colorado and being in the middle of an aspen forest. An aspen forest, I just learned this because I went hiking outside of Aspen a number of years ago. Aspen groves are like they're like a single organism. There's a single living root system underneath that binds all of them together. And so any tree you're looking at, it just happens to be a younger and older expression of the core root system. And that's exactly how the Hebrew Bible works. You have some of the oldest growth, but those oldest growths have themselves spawned and are deeply connected to newer growths that are built from the same type of cell structures as the older ones. I found that as a really helpful metaphor. I didn't make that up. A Hebrew Bible scholar named Timothy Stone made that up. But I found that very helpful because if you've ever noticed, there's a lot of repeated phrases and pattern type of stories and language happening as you read throughout the Old Testament.
This is a really important shift to make when approaching the Bible and when reading the Bible. And I think it's pretty hard to do because we bring so much cultural baggage to the Bible. If the Bible is a unified literary ecosystem, then the meaning doesn't come from an isolated verse or a one-off command that you read. It comes from learning how the whole story works together and how these themes are developed over time, and even later authors intentionally build upon the earlier ones.
Genesis 1 through 3 is in many ways like a tutorial in how to read the rest of the Old Testament. And the main vehicle for it is patterns of repetition. Most anybody can walk away from page 1 of the Bible and be like, oh, there was a pattern of 7 days that I just encountered. And it's through verbal repetition. And God said always begins, each of the 7 days. And there was evening and morning, day 1, day 2, day 3. There's almost always a pronouncement of good. There's just lots of repetition jumping off the page. And so what Genesis 1 is also teaching you to do is how to read a text like this. So then you begin to compare. This is what your mind is doing all the time. From like, you come out of the womb, this is neuroscience, which I'm not a neuroscientist, but they can tell you, like, we're coming out of the womb and your brain is at a subconscious level hyper tracking with repeated experiences and varied experiences, similarities and difference. And so the shape that's in front of me all the time, and that has moving things and says sounds to me, like I began to track, oh, it's like there all day, every day. And the repetition is what trains you. But then another, like a furry one comes in with sharp teeth. It's maybe your family dog or something. I'm like, oh, that's different. I don't like that one. It slobbers on me. And it's similarity and difference. So it's real basic communication. And that's exactly what Genesis 1 is doing. It's through repetition. And so even the different days of the 7 days of Genesis are repeating language from previous days, but also introducing new language. So on every day, there's a pronouncement of something good. But then if you pay attention to that, you notice on day 2, there isn't anything good. But on day 3, it like seems aware of the absence of day 2. So it gives you 2 goods on day 3 to make up for the good that wasn't there on day 2. And so it's all about repetition. And these authors are trying to teach you by repeating things that came before, but with slight variations. That's how they're going to be communicating to you. And so in a microcosm, what Genesis 1 is doing continues throughout the whole rest of the Hebrew scriptures. It's through patterns of repetition that the story is going to make its claims.
Yeah, so this is important. Genesis is not just telling us what happened at the beginning of the world. In fact, it might not be telling us that at all. But that's actually a debate that's going on right now in our times. Is this a scientific telling of the beginning of the world. We got to get that out of our heads. It's not trying to tell us what happened at the beginning. It's training us how to read everything that comes next, what to pay attention to, which words matter, how the story itself is going to carry meaning forward.
So one of the most key repeated words on page 1 of the Bible is the word good. So you have the 7-part design of the cosmos in Genesis 1, and 7 different times there are pronouncements of what God making is good. So forget all the debates. Let's just agree that Genesis 1 begins with uncreated darkness and waste, and it ends with a garden, right? I think everybody from all positions about Genesis 1 can agree on that. And the process from the garden is from darkness and chaos and no life to a process of increasing goodness. And it was good. God separates the waters from the waters. It was good. There was light. There was good. Sun, moon, and stars, good. Creatures, good. And then the culminating good is on the 7th day is not just good, it's an increased good. God saw all that he had made. It was very good. So you walk away from page 1 going, okay, good. It's very important. Good is something God provides. Good is something that God creates, but also gives to others. He gives it to the creatures and gives it to the humans. God is the one with the knowledge of good and the power to create good. Genesis 2, God is the first one to notice something is not good, and it's of a human alone. So a human alone can't fulfill the purpose for which he appointed the humans, which is to rule the world as his partners. And so God, it's a fascinating story, brings one human, has one human out of 2. So they have one humanity made up of 2 humans, and that's good. Then the next thing where the word good appears is God gives to the humans this choice about whether they're going to live in his good world and as his co-rulers, or there's this chance they have to know and to seize knowing good and the opposite of good and take it for themselves. That's the next time the word good appears. And so all of a sudden, you have all this string in the story. You have the string of the word good that puts together a really profound storyline for you. God's the provider of good. Humans wake up in a world of good. When something isn't good, God wants to bring about good. But then also, every human has a choice themselves about whether they're going to trust God's provision and knowledge of good, or am I going to take and know and define good and not good on my own terms? That's a really profound set of claims to make about human nature and the human condition. And it's all happening through the hyperlinking of these stories about good. Okay, so we'll just do one more step. So of course that story goes poorly. There's a snake. There's a snake that's really knows how to take advantage of a situation full of opportunity, and the snake gets the humans to doubt God's goodness and generosity. Um, The snake, this is a good example of repetition. The snake quotes a line that God said in the previous chapter, but he changes one word. So in the previous chapter, God said, eat from any tree of the garden, just not this one. And then this creature speaks to the humans and says, did God say, don't eat from any trees of the garden? It's just one little word, right? He changes changes it from a gift into a question that gets them to become suspicious about God's purposes. And then, of course, that seems to plant a seed for the humans, because then they're like, oh, yeah, there's that one, and I want it. So it's all about humans before a decision about good and what they're going to do in response to what an animal's saying to them. We know how that famous story goes. Okay, right. The companion story right next to it is about the man and the woman. It's about their kids, the next generation. And it's the famous story of Cain and Abel. And in this story, God also does something puzzling. Like in the Garden of Eden, like what's up with the tree and like why not? I kind of understand about good, but what's up with that tree? But it's puzzling, right? Like God doesn't say, don't eat from the tree and here's why. It's left a mystery for the reader and for the characters. They just have to trust. In the same way, the next generation, God does something that isn't explained. He accepts one son's offering, but not another son's offering. This is a famous puzzle in the story of Cain and Abel. You know why? But then the whole story is about how the humans are going to respond to something God has said or done that doesn't make sense to them. And so you're like, oh, that's interesting. It's a very similar kind of story, totally different set of circumstances, but those stories are actually similar in terms of that theme, aren't they? And then what's interesting is that Cain gets really angry about how God favors his brother. And then what God says to him, it's the next repetition of the word good in the story. God says to him, "Why are you angry?" If God says, "If you do good, you will be lifted up. If you do good, there will be exaltation." And then he says, "But listen, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you can rule it." Almost every line in there is a little vocabulary copy and paste from the previous 2 chapters. So, sin, crouching like an animal. Have I encountered any other crafty animals that are there with the humans at the moment they need to make the key moral choice? Oh yeah, that was the snake in the previous story. Now it's the abstract concept of sin, but sin's crouching like an animal trying to get you. Its desire is for you. So the desire, actually, this is a whole, we don't have time to go down this rabbit hole, but that's a copy and paste from something in Genesis chapter 3 about some kind of what seems to be an inverted or antagonistic desire. But sin wants you the same way that there's going to be this relational conflict between the man and the woman in chapter 3. But you can rule over it. That's what God said the humans were to do over creation on page 1. And then, of course, Cain doesn't do good. He murders his brother. So that's a good example. So Genesis 3 and 4 are 2 stories put next to each other. And it's actually through thematic pairing and then key vocabulary copy and pasting between the 2 stories that get you to compare the 2 stories. All of a sudden, you have to go for a long walk and just think about, oh, how is the garden temptation similar to Cain and Abel's story? How is it different? And then what you see is this portrait developing in the story of the human condition and of humans as these deceived but also rather selfish creatures uh, who even unwittingly or sometimes purposefully spread death and create and relational chaos in the world that creates violence and bloodshed. And all we're doing is tracking with keywords here. And so what the Hebrew Bible authors do is what happened between Genesis 3 and Genesis 4 with repeated words just keeps happening. It keeps cycling on itself. And so you'll be in a story about Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 16, and it's a story about how 2 people, a man and a woman, Abraham and Sarah, God said they're going to have a kid, but we can't have any kids. But they see this Egyptian slave that they have, and they take her and do what is good in their eyes to her. And it's all this language in that story from the Genesis 3 temptation story. And so, and there's thematic parallels. It's a husband and a wife, and they don't trust God, and they do what's good in their own eyes, and it results in oppression and all sorts of terrible things happen. And so this is just how it works, man. Every single story as you go through the Bible is a set of networked patterns on earlier stories, almost always going back to Genesis 1 through 11. It's as if Genesis 1 through 11 is like a playbook that's giving you a template of what humans are and what humans do. And then the rest of the Hebrew Bible is just playing out the playbook in hundreds of different little variations.
Yeah, I love this. This is so important because Tim isn't defending a doctrine or trying to win an argument or something like that. He's slowing down. He's showing how meaning emerges from the text itself when you follow its internal logic instead of importing our modern expectations back onto the text.
Are you a Star Wars fan-ish? If you've seen the old trilogy and then you're watching the new trilogy unfold, you probably noticed, along with lots of people, that there's very intentional repetitions happening. To speak of the obvious, the Death Star, right? The big Death Star is like the big, terrible threat to be avoided in both the first trilogy and the first movie of the new trilogy. And those the destruction of the Death Star scenes, they're very similar, right? And it all focuses on one going into a trench and having to shoot the torpedo into a very small little that kind of thing. So when we encounter this in other forms of communication, we don't even think about it. We're like, "Oh yeah, that's how it works." And the whole point is you compare the two Death Star battle scenes, their similarities and their differences. And the meditation on the similarities and differences begins to help you understand these new characters, like how Poe Dameron is different from Luke Skywalker, but also how he's similar. And then that becomes a vehicle of the movie's message and thematic claims. And so it's no different. It's a very basic form of human communication is repetition and then variation. And the Hebrew Bible is just using this tool. It's like the primary medium of it.
Yeah, I think this is helpful because it shows me that the idea that this was just a coincidence, that there's so much repetition and patterns, it can't be. It just falls apart. Repetition at this scale isn't accidental. It's not unique to the Bible either. We do this in our lives. This is how intentional stories communicate meaning. They echo earlier moments and they invite you to connect those dots yourself. I think of this all the time when I'm watching a movie or reading a book. They don't give you all the information. My favorite shows, the comedies and things, they don't do the whole joke for you. They let you fill in the details. And part of that is what makes it so fun and makes that connection so strong when you actually kind of put it all together and get what they're trying to do. You like smile and laugh because you're like, oh, okay, yeah, it takes a bit of intelligence to do that.
Another metaphor I use is hyperlinking, like on a web page. Often it seems as if the biblical authors will intentionally phrase something in an odd way
Mm.
in a later story, intentionally to make you go, "Oh, that's a good one." Oh, like here's a good example. So later in the story, there's a story about Abram. He goes to a Philistine town named Gerar. This is in Genesis 20, and he thinks they're going to kill him because his wife is beautiful of sight, which is exactly what the tree of knowledge of good and evil is called. And he's afraid that they're going to take her and then kill him, which is all, and think in the tree in Genesis 3, it's all about the tree is beautiful of sight and, they take from the tree and so on. But then Abraham actually plays the role of the snake in that story because he's the deceiver. He's the one lying in order to preserve his own life. And then God actually comes to the king in a dream and so on. There's all kinds of other things going on. But at the end of the story, the king gets really angry that Abraham lied to him. And God's the one who tells on Abraham. And then the king says, like, hey, get out of here. I'll command that no one touches you. He says, I give a command that no one touches you. Do you remember what the woman said in Genesis 3? God commanded us saying, don't touch the tree. And then he says, the king gives a command saying, don't touch Abraham or his wife. And then the king gives Abraham and Sarah this money to like pay off for psychological damages or something. And then what he says about the money is he says, this will be as a covering for the eyes. It's just a very odd phrase in Hebrew and in English. The money covers your eyes? That's so weird. But if you think about it, it's exactly an inversion of the Genesis 3 story, which is they took from the thing that was beautiful and it was opening their eyes. And so the thing that was taken that opened their eyes in Genesis 3 is being bounced off of in Genesis, where it was all about a deceiver, Abraham, and a woman who's beautiful of sight and who's taken and who's giving back. And to undo the deception, we need to cover the eyes instead of have them opened. So it's a good example where these authors are very clever. They're very creative in how they're hyperlinking and recalling stories. But if I could show you Genesis 20 and the list of vocabulary that matches Genesis 3, it's just right there again, just like the two Death Star stories in the two Star Wars narratives. And so, yes, you're right. I've been living this paradigm for a couple of years, but it happens enough that it's like you get trained to read the stories this way. And each story that comes along later, you're looking for clues. Now, once you see one keyword, you're like, oh, that's a keyword in Genesis 3, the eyes, or people being blind or seeing or not seeing. And then it trains you to look for other keywords as you go through.
Yeah, this idea of hyperlinking is really crucial here. The Bible assumes that we're patient, that we're attentive readers, that we are tracking connections across time, not just grabbing isolated verses here and there for quick answers. It takes dedication and determination to understand this.
Well, yeah, the word literal is so fraught with complexities and baggage and emotions um, in our moment. So I think anytime the word literal versus whatever metaphorical comes up, you just have to say, try your best to define what you mean by that. I can't answer your question without knowing what you mean by the word literal. And I find as I press students when I'm in classroom settings to do that is people have wildly different definitions of what they think even a literal reading of the Bible represents. So, um, what I mean when I use the word literal is I'm looking for the literary meaning. In other words, um, whenever somebody sits down to craft a piece of written communication, they use literary conventions and words and paragraphs or repetition, whatever culture, whatever that culture uses. But they usually, like when I write down something, I mean something by it.
Mm.
And I mean the person who reads it to read it and understand, at least hopefully, basically what I'm saying. And there it is. So that's what I mean by the literal meaning, is the meaning that the author wants me to grasp as I read this text. In the modern era, meaning has become synonymous with understanding its historical referent. If I understand the event to which it refers, and that's its meaning. But of course, an event doesn't have meaning.
Mhm.
I don't know the meaning of what brushing my teeth meant this morning. um, I don't know the meaning of why I'm at my in-laws for Thanksgiving. But maybe in 5 years I'll begin to see this weekend played a key role in something that happened and this thing and the things that followed from it. And then I could craft a story about the meaning of the weekend. But if I crafted that narrative, that wouldn't be the same thing as what actually happened here. I don't know the meaning of any of this. And so uh, I think the literal meaning that is going to be most helpful to modern readers is learning how to understand what an author meant by giving a literary representation of their history.
I love the way that Mackie talks about what literal means and kind of reframes it as this meaning of like discovering what the author intended to convey using their tools, the literary tools of their world. And so it's always going to be a bit of a investigation for us because we have to pay attention to how a text is actually trying to communicate and even what their world that they were communicating from was like and the things they were thinking about. But it's so important.
If you think about it, tradition literature and foundation stories of like a people or a culture, these are stories that matter deeply to these people because they're identity forming stories. This is our story. We're the Exodus people. The Exodus story made a deep impact on the identity and practices of the Israelite people over the course of millennia and still today, for those who choose to live by those rituals. And so I think it's that the way that these literary texts refer to history is often by a different set of conventions than how we think of a literary text representing a history.
Mm.
I think for sure, like it's a different culture, a totally different culture. So for me, actually, my hang up is with the word accuracy,
Mm.
because that itself just speaks of a cultural value that we have. Actually, here, this is very interesting to think about. So, it is the meaning of an event captive to how accurately you portray it. I often use the example of my wife and I met and dated and got married over the course of about 2 years. And when we're often meeting people, I'd be like, "Oh, how'd you guys meet and get married?" We've been married 18 years, and so we have a really we've told it so many times. We have a long version, a medium version, a short version, and we kind of know the cues of what parts and who says what at what part, and what we've actually done is condensed many events down into a shorter number of events. I know we've talked about it before. We've merged multiple days at the beach into one day at the beach and so on in our retelling. So it's sort of like, is it inaccurate? Well, It's not video camera footage, but in another sense, it's very accurate. I lived it. And what it is it's a faithful representation of that season of my life. And the way that we tell it is trying to help people understand the meaning that we can now see in these events, and how they work together. And so accuracy um, is part of the equation, but it's not the only value driving how we form that narrative. And so I think something analogous is going on with the biblical authors. And so, yeah, all kinds of stuff. Like chronology is not the utmost value. They're constantly rearranging events and putting them, and they don't even hide it. I mean, the book of Ezekiel has a real clear chronological scheme, and there's just some sections that are just so clearly have been relocated to a different section of a book. And it's not trying to hide it because their value isn't to give you video camera footage. It's hard for moderns to wrap our minds around a different culture's way of representing their history. But I think we have to learn how to read these texts sympathetically on their own terms, or else I think we're just destined to kind of misread them.
I think this is a turning point here. Once you realize the Bible isn't trying to answer every modern question that we have with specific precision or something, but instead to shape wisdom through story, it really helps with a lot of the confusion of what this book is and what it's supposed to be doing and how we can use it. Doesn't clear up everything, but it definitely helps correct some of those unhelpful ways that the Bible is often used. Okay, that's the end of part 1 of our conversation with Tim Mackie. In the next episode, Tim takes this same framework and applies it to faith, to ethics, and to Jesus himself. If the Bible isn't a rule book, how does it actually shape a life? That's where this is going to get real interesting and real fun. And if you resonate with what we're trying to do at Faith Lab, bringing serious biblical scholarship out of the academy and into real conversations, one of the best ways to support the work is at faithlabshow.com/support. That's where you'll find our bonus episodes. We have a whole bonus podcast that we do, our private community, and other supporter-only content. And if you don't have the means to support financially, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and sharing an episode with a friend, it genuinely makes a real big difference and helps more people discover this work. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.